I must say that it is an enormous pleasure to be here tonight, and a great honor as well. It's not only a wonderful chance to talk about the research that I've been doing for the past 10 years in the region, where it's been one of the very important part of this, but it's also a great honor to be doing this as a part of the Sir Arthur Lewis Memorial Lecture Series. So let's see if this, okay. And as you know, as we just heard on the in that short video, Sir Arthur Lewis was the first Black student admitted to the LSE and the first Black teacher there. What's really striking is, of course, that the first Black student didn't have to be as good as all the other students. He had to be good enough to go on and win a Nobel Prize. And so finally, after many years, the LSE has recognized the achievements that he brought to the university, created over the course of his career, and has finally named this, you can sit over here, this brand new building, enormous, beautiful, on Lincoln's Inn Fields, the Sir Arthur Lewis building is now at the LSE, and it's wonderful. So it's from the LSE that I come here today to talk to you. And to talk about an issue that I think has been very important to the region, namely citizenship by investment. So here are the websites of the 5 countries in the region that have these programs. There are, to give a sense of the way this works globally, there's summits all over the world where people go and they look at the options that are there. Here's one that was quite recent in London. There's events here in the region. The last time I had the honor of being in St. Kitts was right before COVID, when you can see some of the key people behind the programs having a panel on these as well. And so it's a very important part of the region. And we all know that citizenship by investment is out there, but I want to take the opportunity to think about a couple of different things around it. First, what is the future of CBI going to look like? What are the benefits and the risks for economic development? And what does this mean for the region? So I'll be hitting on those topics tonight, but I'll be doing this based on quite a lot of fieldwork and study that I've put in over the past decade. So since 2015, I've put my own pretty privileged passport. I'm a US citizen, and I've been in the UK long enough to naturalize there. And I've now been to over 22 countries on 6 continents, and I've talked to more than 500 people to find out how it all works. So I've talked to lawyers, service providers, government officials, wealthy buyers, local populations, put together a data set on the programs as well. And so I've tried to understand how this whole world works. And I'll share those findings with you today and how I've approached it as an academic researcher as well. But let's start off with the basics. First off, what is citizenship by investment? Now, sometimes it gets described as cash for passports. But of course, it's not really that. And in fact, it gets confused often with 2 neighboring things. We've got citizenship by investment, sometimes known as golden passports, but I'll discuss what goes into that. And sometimes it gets confused with what I describe as discretionary economic citizenship, as well as residence by investment programs, or golden visas. So in the first instance, there's discretionary economic citizenship. And I apologize for the, sometimes when you move from one computer to another, the labeling of the font don't transfer so well. So I apologize for any, differences that are suddenly appearing. They're new to me too. I hope it's not too confusing either. So discretionary economic citizenship. Any sovereign, any state can grant citizenship to whomever it wants. And it can do so on whatever grounds it wants. And it can do this in a discretionary manner. And this happens, virtually every country in the world would do this. It's like kind of, France made, this is Macron with Snapchat billionaires, Evan Spiegel. He became a citizen of France in California. New Zealand made Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, a citizen after he spent a few days there and donated to an earthquake relief fund. But these are effectively individualized discretionary grants for economic reasons, right? It's very individualized and personal. Citizenship by investment is different. These are formal government programs that grant citizenship based on a predefined investment, usually real estate, sometimes business, or a monetary donation to the country. So from the government's perspective, it's often seen as, we make you a citizen because you've done something substantial for us. Now, these programs will have set price points, they've got specified investment types, they have clear time frames, there's a formal application process, but it's set in a way through a bureaucratic process as well, so that basically anyone with the qualifications can apply, and they might be rejected as well. And if you are approved, typically the programs, if we look globally, you can become a citizen in between a few months to a year. Now, citizenship by investment is also different from residence by investment programs, these sorts of golden visa programs, which are actually all over the world. We have them in Portugal, Spain, US. We've gotten a lot of new coverage of the Trump Gold Card recently. In fact, about 60 countries have golden visa programs on offer. But this is different to citizenship by investment too, because citizenship is very different to residence. The rights are different, so with citizenship, you can apply to the government to get a passport, whereas a residence is just a visa and a passport. The stakes and the trajectories are different. Citizenship is inheritable, whereas residence is not, so it becomes a longer-term relationship that gets passed down through a family. Citizenship is harder to lose and to revoke than residence. Often with residence by investment programs, if you sell the investment, you lose the visa. And demand can be quite different too. Sometimes people are only looking for residence. Not everybody's looking for citizenship as well. And not all countries with residence by investment programs enable people to become citizens either. Thailand, for example, very, very popular residence by investment program, but no pathway to citizenship. So these are two very different things. Now, if that's how we can look at citizenship by investment for research purposes, which is what I do as a professor, we can then ask, where do we find it? So where is citizenship by investment? Now, one way to look at where these programs are is just simply to look at the laws on the books, in terms of the definitions that I was setting out earlier. And when we look at that globally, these are countries with programs that have had programs in the past 10 years. You can see that they're actually in quite a number of world regions. Oh, good, we can have it here too. Okay. These are countries with legal provisions, so whether you have a real operating program and are approving people or not is a different question, but we have the Caribbean, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Pacific Rim. More countries in Europe have begun to close down programs recently, but we can see that they're actually quite broad, and so I think that's important to keep in mind too. It's not just in the Caribbean. Just as a side note, what about golden visas? As I said before, it's in nearly 60 countries. It's 59 countries plus 5 dependencies. These are all over the world. And we also find them in the Caribbean too. So Anguilla, Bahamas, Barbados, Bermuda, Cayman, Curacao, Dominican Republic all have residence by investment programs as well. Now, we can also, just going back into the basics, when did this all start? If we're just looking at the legal provisions, we can see that before the 1990s, a number of countries had programs. Pakistan did have a legal provision in 1951, but I've never heard of anybody naturalizing through this. And so when St. Kitts often takes credit for really kicking things off, there's reason for that. The timeline goes from 2005 to the present. And I think what's really interesting here in looking at the countries as well is that most of the countries with programs now, we've seen some countries enter, some countries leave. But they've really taken off since 2013. So if we look at the countries with citizenship by investment provisions today, about half of those have started in the past 12 years or so. And what's also important to note is that, if it used to be, small island developing countries, oftentimes former British colonies, now we've got a lot of interesting entrants. So Turkey, for example, Egypt, for example, Jordan, for example, all have started programs. Now, we can also ask, why are people interested in this? Why do people want a quote-unquote golden passport? And it's important to remember, too, that there's a difference between citizenship and a passport. And I think that's really important, too. Now, citizenship by investment is about citizenship. You can be a citizen of a country and not have a passport, and about half of all US citizens fall into that category. You know, they don't have a passport, but they're a citizen. You could have a passport but not have citizenship, and a lot of people all over the world with diplomatic passports are not necessarily citizens of the countries they're representing. And it's also important to remember too that citizenship does not entitle you to a passport. I think India is the only exception. You're allowed to apply for it. And in fact, you don't even own your own passport. If you look at your passport, it will say that it is the property of the government that's issuing it as well. So I think that's also important to keep in mind in some of these debates too. So now we can look at why people go for it, because they do tend to think of it as a quote unquote golden passport, even though it really is citizenship that's at stake. I argued with Harvard University Press about the title of my book. I was like, but it's not a golden passport, but they kind of insisted on that one. But I think it's important to remember that it's citizenship. So why do people go for this? Now, some people think that it's only criminals and money launderers who are interested, and of course journalists have exposed some of those cases. You know, the bad apples who have gotten approved as well, those do exist. But for the most part, the motives are pretty mundane, and I've traveled around the world and talked to a lot of people who are looking into these options. So the first one that comes up is mobility in the present. It's visa-free travel. You know, it reminds me, for example, of a tech entrepreneur whom I met in Dubai. He had a PhD. He was the head of regional sales in Dubai for a major international company. But because he was from Pakistan, he could only go to about 35 countries visa-free, and he had to travel a lot. And he said, I get my visas, it's just a hassle. And so I encountered a lot of people saying this: I want to be able to travel or live wherever I want without worrying about the visa. And sometimes we also see people with quote-unquote good passports, like US citizens, seeking out alternative mobility options because of the danger they may face because of, for example, kidnapping in certain parts of the world. I've encountered people like that as well. But it's not just present mobility, it can be also future mobility, a sort of plan B. Citizenship is an insurance policy. So what is Xi Jinping going to do next? What is Recep Erdogan going to do next? And you know, as one interview I spoke to described, in an authoritarian regime, the key thing is to retain flexibility. So many people are looking for an option just in case. An extra passport is a way to hedge risks. Now, what's been really interesting in looking at this field is that who those people are has changed dramatically over the past 10 years. So in 2015, there were very few US citizens whom I encountered who were looking at these options, but now we see more and more because they're worried about the government, they don't trust the government, they're not quite sure, they don't feel safe any longer, and they're not necessarily looking to move immediately. They want, you know, simply a place they can go when they begin to feel incredibly unsafe as well. Another reason I encountered in the field was lifestyle options, this sort of thing of I'm doing it for the children, you know, naturalize in Malta so you can have access to Swiss doctors. One person I spoke to came from a very wealthy family, but he was expected to work. And he said, there's an unspoken hierarchy for employment, and my parents have been adamant about my employability. He was a young adult from East Asia, and he was very wealthy, and he was thinking about working in Europe. But he was thinking about the way that it might be easier depending on his citizenship. And then the final reason are business opportunities, financial moves, you know, wealth structuring, these sorts of things. So as one interviewer I spoke to described, you know, it's just much, if you're doing business in Europe, it's just much easier to be European. It's more efficient. You know, so everything from import tax issues, banking issues, getting lines of credit, you know, all sorts of things important to doing business globally can depend on your nationality. And this is where it becomes interesting, you know, geopolitics plays a big role too. So it's not always only about getting into the West. When I was in Dubai, I was struck by, you know, there's a lot of Iranians in Dubai, but they can get hit by US sanctions because they apply to all Iranians globally. So you could have been in Dubai since 1979, but you're still feeling that impact from the US. So there can be, you know, business benefits people are interested in, you know, some, you know, and it can also, you know, thinking about, you know, possibilities for financial crime that people talk about too. So, for example, in Cambodia, which has a citizenship by investment program, they naturalize a couple hundred, you know, around, you know, sometimes in a good year, maybe 500 people. About a third of those people have changed their names in their passports. You know, so those concerns can be very, very real. I think that's changed a lot in the Caribbean as well. So how many people are we talking about then? If those are the motives for why people would be looking at these options, how many people go for them? So it's very difficult to get good numbers on the programs and good numbers globally and good numbers from so many different countries. So this is the best I've been able to do so far in looking at the global image. So this is based on government reports, it's sometimes based on official statements, sometimes it's based on extrapolations based on official statements as well. And the numbers that I can say this, with any kind of gesture globally, go up to 2019. In part because COVID-19 had a big impact on applications and processing, and also in part because just the scene has got more varied and mixed since then, and it's just hard to get good global numbers. But these are the countries that have been running really active programs. It's one thing to have the law in the books, it's another thing to have an active program. And we see it's basically been 5 in the Caribbean, Malta, although Malta closed its program a couple of months ago, Vanuatu, Turkey have been very main ones. And the result is that about, maybe about 2,500 applications get approved each, or 25,000 get approved each year. But that also, you have to remember that each application is not just the main applicant, it's the family members too. So for each investment or each donation, you'll have the main applicant, and then on average, about 1.7 additional family members getting citizenship as well. And so here you can also see that historically, the Caribbean has been a big, big part of the global markets. The Caribbean, a little bit of Europe. You can see the rise of Vanuatu to some degree, and then you see Turkey just shooting through the roof. So Turkey started off at $1 million US. In 2018, it dropped the price point to $250,000 US, and you could invest in real estate, and then just the numbers skyrocketed. And they continued on beyond that. So the numbers for Turkey I have are based on tweets by the Minister of the Interior. But that's the best I've been able to do, and since he's the Minister of the Interior, I'm kind of going with that. But Turkey is, at that point in time, probably about half the global market as well. Now, if we break this down individually, I don't have such complete coverage in terms of individual country approvals. So these are just the countries that I've been able to get data on, and they go up to 2022. 3 in the Caribbean, so St. Lucia, Antigua, Grenada, and then Cyprus, Malta, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Jordan. And we can see that in most cases, this has been about 500 applications or less in many places. I think if we were to get good numbers now for 2024, 2025, we'd see much bigger numbers in some of these places. But it's interesting that this is what it looks like when you add Vanuatu, a much bigger proportion. And then if you add in Turkey, it's even bigger. So I think this is, and if we were to look now at, for example, Egypt and Jordan, we'd probably see much higher numbers too, because they'll still naturalize Russians. And we'd probably see higher numbers for some of the Caribbean countries as well. So this is part of the bigger global scene in which the Caribbean operates, and in which it's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about where the region is as well. So where are these people from then? We have all these people getting citizenship. So this is where I've been able to get data on country of origin, and I put the Eastern Caribbean over on the left and the other countries where I was able to get those data on the right, and you can see the total averages for the region. In blue are Chinese, in dark blue is the rest of Asia, so in the Caribbean there's around 30%, 33%, about a third. Then above that we have green, so Russia and former Soviet states. We see much more interest in Cyprus, Montenegro, sort of that neck of the woods. In pink, people from Middle East and North Africa, also we see a lot of interest in the Caribbean coming from that. Yellow is Anglophone, which is kind of a tricky category. It's basically the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So countries that have this reputation for being countries of immigration, places to go where you put your kids in school. But we also see people from these countries, largely US and Canada, also taking an interest in the Caribbean. And then African countries in purple, much bigger interest in the Caribbean and growing recently as well. So if this is where people are from and where they're going and where they're selecting, what about those countries themselves? What about places in the Caribbean? So among others as well, what do countries get out of it? What are the benefits? And then we should also consider what are the risks. So in thinking about these these issues, I think it's important to kind of think also about the bigger global context. So in the Caribbean, we've got the 5 Eastern Caribbean countries plus El Salvador recently launched a program. It's $1 million in crypto. So I don't know how popular it's been so far. The light blue countries have a legal provision on the books, but they're not really using them actively at present. Comoros is kind of a gray area case in a lot of ways. But Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, Cambodia, Nauru, Vanuatu have been important as well. And Sao Tome has recently opened a program too. Now, one common justification that governments give for opening programs is the need for revenue or economic investment. And so in talking about benefits and risks, I'll focus mainly on that today, although there are a lot of ways that people can talk about that, and we can discuss those in questions as well. So we can look first at what is the form and amount of money that countries are setting? What are those targets? So in terms of the investment options, it's usually, for most countries, number one, government donation, then they'll probably add real estate as well as a business investment. Some countries have government bonds, some countries have stocks, funds, and shares, some countries have others. And then what we see on the figure is what are the minimum investment amounts. So in the Eastern Caribbean, I put the countries on top, there's been an agreement to make a floor of at least $200,000, and you can see how the investment options are now really lining up along that. And that's pretty much, kind of middle of the road globally as well. You can see Jordan through the roof, $1.4 million in stocks, funds, and shares. You can see El Salvador is also very, very high. You can see too, though, that Sao Tome and Nauru are now at about 100,000 US as well, but offering the benefits that are on offer in effect are quite different over there than in the Caribbean as well. So that's just part of this global spread in which the Caribbean is operating. If we want to know what people are actually choosing, we can look at let's look at what they do in practice. And so I'm gonna here zoom in on the Caribbean cases. And we can look at which options people choose over time. So I've been able to get data for Dominica, Antigua, St. Lucia, and Grenada. And we can see that people go for either real estate or government donations. They tend not to do business, they tend not to do government bonds, they don't do other things on offer. These are the main things that they're really looking for. Now, let's break those down, see what's happening, both in terms of the government donations and then in terms of real estate. So from the government budgets, and you can go online and access all these, this is how I got those numbers. Go online, look at the government budget numbers. Here, the amount of money governments are getting in tax revenue is in gray. Other sorts of revenue they get is in orange. And then the revenue going to the government from CBI programs, which is going to be typically donations and fees, is in blue. And this is what's declared in the government budgets. Grenada, until about 2 years ago, kept it as a separate accounting category, so I put their CBI column slightly different from the rest because the counting is done slightly different, although now it's harmonized with the rest of the region. And this is what it's looked like over time, so since earlier days in the program. So in St. Kitts and Dominique, it's been about 30% of the government revenue, in Antigua about 10%, smaller in St. Lucia, less than 5% in Grenada, upwards of 20% as well. But if we look more recently, this is just 2022 to 2023, we can see it's been much, much bigger. Part of this is also because the numbers of approvals have grown over time as well. So now in Dominica and in St. Kitts, it's about 60% of government revenue. In Grenada, it's about 20%. Antigua, it's just under 10%. And St. Lucia, it's under 5%. So this, the biggest correlation here is country size and the importance of this as a revenue source for governments. The smaller the country, the more important it's become for the government to run as well. So the IMF would question, is this, creating too much of a dependency on a single revenue source? And I think that's an important issue to debate as well. But you can see that it's become a really important revenue source for governments to run and carry out their business. What about real estate? Now, the impact on real estate is much, much more difficult to evaluate. We do get things like resorts that get built or get upgraded, and this can contribute to the construction sector, it can contribute to the tourism sector, it can contribute to local employment. You know, we get some things like, this is a road that I drove past last time I was in Grenada that had been built through Citizenship by investment funds. But I think, as everybody in the region would know, there's also been a history of uncompleted projects that don't create as much value for the money or as much value for the country as been hoped as well. And one reason for this is there's a really complex global industry around it with these extended supply chains. So there's these big chains of service providers that connect people to countries, and there's lots of money that flow down that supply chain as well. And that has a big impact on the economic benefit to countries, which might not see all the benefits that are promised. So if we know that governments have now begun to really rely on these revenues to keep them going, you know, especially during difficult times, especially when there aren't a lot of alternatives, this can also make us think about some of the risks to keep in mind too. Now, some international actors, like the OECD, FATF, US, UK, EU, IMF, have produced reports on these programs, and they've identified what are, for them, the key risks. So at the international level, they'll say there's identity laundering risks, money laundering risks, security risks, tax risks. And at the local level for the countries, they'll say there's risks around corruption, risks of loss of visa-free travel, risks of over-economic dependence as well. So sometimes their analyses, I'd say there's a bit of politicking going on behind it. Sometimes there's poor research design. So, you know, in the FATF OECD report, there's a lot that's, I think, you know, right on in terms of that report, but there's also parts where I think, you know, actually the risks that you're identifying and pointing fingers at are much bigger in other channels that are effectively, as they define it, they're interested in this sort of exchange of documents for financial contributions or money. And if you want to look at the risks around discretionary economic citizenship, gray market documents, diplomatic passports, black market documents, some of these risks are much, much bigger. And so there can be a tendency to finger point as well. And it's also important to remember that, you know, the EU has been putting a lot of pressure on Caribbean countries. The EU hasn't been pressuring a country like Turkey, for example, but the EU also pays Turkey 9 billion euros to keep refugees out of Europe. So there's a real politics in the background of this, which probably, to be honest, in thinking about Europe, probably every banana grower in the region would know about as well. But you know, there's still things. I think, you know, some of these topics are still important topics for debate and discussion and figuring out here in the region where people think programs should go. So these international, you know, international actors have raised these risks. But what's interesting too is we've also seen here in the region movements to make changes and improve programs to make sure that they're run more transparently and run more effectively. Recently here at the ECCB, I wasn't a part of this, but they've put together a statement or a set of draft legislation for the Eastern Caribbean Citizenship by Investment Regulatory Authority. You can go online and see the draft legislation that's going through the countries right now, and I do encourage everybody. I think it's important to, you know, this is an important local debate, and it's important to inform yourself, to be a part of this debate in an intelligent way. So. I was having a look through it this afternoon, and it was making sure that countries agreed to regional standards regarding program operation, regarding due diligence checks, those background checks, and to be honest, in the Caribbean right now, they're often stronger than what you find in Europe for standard visas. Procedures around interviews and name changes, procedures around audits and escrow accounts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot, I think, that's being done in the region to tighten things up. And so this is your homework, right? So I'm a professor. You know, it's hard to stand in front of an audience like this and not talk about assignments and discussion and homework. But I think there needs to be like real informed discussion here. And that's up to you here in the region. So the international players have weighed in, but what's the local assessment? What are the benefits? What are the risks? What are the alternatives? And, you know, what's the right balance? And that's for people here to decide. And it's a decision and a discussion, I think, that needs to also occur, keeping this bigger global scene in mind too, including where things are going. Because it's easy if you're in the Eastern Caribbean, just think about the Eastern Caribbean, but there's a much bigger picture. So for example, we've seen this year a new entrant, Sao Tome. Next year, Botswana is planning to open a program, and there may be others as well. And there's other bigger shifts in the world too, in this wider scene of which the Eastern Caribbean is a part. We see shifts in the internal politics of countries. And I say that as a US citizen. 10 years ago, there were not many US citizens looking at these options, and now there's a lot more. We see shifts in the geopolitics between countries. So for example, Russian citizens may disagree with the war in Ukraine, they may disagree with Putin, but they still face a lot of difficulties in living global lives and carrying out, and even just carrying out their jobs. Because of those geopolitics, because of where they're from. Sanctions are being increasingly used by a weapon. We're seeing shifts in the places of wealth accumulation as well, and that will be compounded even more with changes coming down the road with AI, as well as climate change. So we see new places where people are looking to, for different options. We're seeing shifts in how identity documents works and are used for travel. We're seeing more retina scans, for example. The biometricization of identity documents too will change things in this field. And we see people are now living much more mobile and multi-based lives. We've seen the rise, for example, especially since COVID-19, of, say, digital nomads, of people looking to base themselves out of different places, to just keep on moving, and they're thinking about quality of life. They're often, kind of middle-class earners with good educations, but they can get a better quality of life elsewhere in the world. And so we've seen a lot more interest in mobility rather than, say, immigration. So we need to keep that bigger context in mind, too, when we're thinking about local questions here. And I think that's true when we're thinking about strategies for resilience. Now, you saw how important these programs have become to basic government budgets, and the smaller the country's population, the more reliant they are. But I think we also need to be asking about what this means for resilience in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. So can the programs help develop countries for the benefits of its people? If so, what does that look like? What changes can we make to improve that element? And if we're thinking about resilience, we also need to be thinking about what is the legacy of the decisions that are being made today. Not just thinking about the moment, but what's the long-term impact, both benefits and risks. Now, we see, for example, a lot of people have interest in, just getting the passport and haven't been interested in the country themselves. But it could be interesting as well if more people do start taking an interest in the countries issuing this, looking for other ways to connect back or give back to the countries as well. And that can raise a whole host of, for example, social issues that I haven't even touched on today. So the fact is that these aren't easy questions to answer, which is actually why I kind of love studying this field. It's always changing, and it's always making me question a lot of my fundamental assumptions about the world. Because this world of citizenship by investment, what it does is it exposes those real complexities of globalization and the world that we're living in today. So if I were to offer my 2 cents here, I'd say the future of the world is one of increasing mobility rather than a story of immigration, like just going from place A to place B. We're going to see more mobility as well. Programs can be a tool in the development toolkit. It's not up to me to decide for a country. It's for a country to decide whether they want a program or not. And it can be a tool in that, but it can be, for some countries, a real lifeline as well when there aren't a lot of other options. But in order for that to assist development, if that is the path chosen by a country, you really need good regulations, and regulations with teeth for that to work well, to make sure that the benefits are really being, potential benefits are being really used to build the country. And especially thinking about the Eastern Caribbean, regional cooperation is absolutely crucial for this to happen. Without regional cooperation, it won't work, and it will be a race to the bottom. And there have been points in time when there has been a race to the bottom, between countries kind of trying to compete against each other. And I think for thinking about the region, that's not a great strategy. Because outside of the region, most people can't even tell the difference between the countries. It's sort of like one country says one thing and everybody thinks it's all the same. But it's also, I know, and I'm not even sure, like even thinking about Donald Trump, if he could even remember the names of the different countries and get those right. But it's, that element of regional cooperation is absolutely important. So, I've been studying this for a number of years. If you're interested in seeing more of my work in this space, I've done a lot of research reports as well. You can go to my website. This is my personal website where I've got it in a more friendly manner. It's presented in a friendlier manner than the LSE does it right now. They've just revamped their website, so it's actually really hard to get good reports from that. But you can go here, check out my work, inform yourself, but then make your own decision. So I'll wrap things up there because I'm really interested in hearing from you and what you think and what your comments and questions are. So thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me. And it's been, fantastic to be able to engage this topic.